We're going to start on the legislative process, federal commerce power. Commerce power gets somewhat complicated because, as I mentioned before, commerce becomes more complicated. And so, while in the beginning is, I think, relatively easier to follow, as we move along, it becomes a little bit more difficult. I think the thing to keep in mind is that that power has expanded to the point that it really has very little meaning in terms of limiting congressional power under the Commerce Clause. So in the beginning, it was basically determining whether there was a substantial effect on commerce. In other words, is the activity that's being regulated because it substantially affects commerce? The idea, remember, was that you wanted commerce to fly. You wanted commerce to be open between states and with foreign nations. So the first thing that we had to look at, or the Supreme Court had to look at, was the government action or regulation or statute, was it there because the action was trying to control substantially affected commerce? The second sort of standard was reasonable means. This is a very common theme, right? It's not just whether or not Congress can act, it's whether or not Congress can act in a way that's reasonable, which typically means that is there a government or a congressional objective here? And does that objective serve the larger population in some way? It doesn't have to be directly at this point one would expect it to be, but even that moves out of the way at some point. So fundamentally, what Congress thinks that what it is doing falls within its commerce power based on those two criteria, then the court will really disagree with that. The court will yield to that, especially when the activity being regulated is itself commercial in nature. Okay, so remember that. Keep in mind that the 10th Amendment is a limit on Congress's power. Right? It says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Occasionally limits Congress' ability to use the Commerce Clause as a power to regulate the states, but that's the states. Even to this day, states obviously have authority to control a whole cadre of issues. I think more than most people would recognize. So in the beginning, it was about regulating really foreign and Indian regulation. In the beginning, it was about commerce between the states. And again, the commerce that was taking place was very limited in scope, not as complicated as it is today. So if you look at the limitation on states versus the limitation on Congress, the Commerce Clause serves two distinct functions. The first is that it acts as a source of congressional authority. Congress has the right to, act, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is implicitly, again, a lot of implied powers, right? There's a limitation on state legislative power, okay? So if you look at sort of the chronological approach here, the federal commerce power really chronologically starts with the development of power in a relatively clear fashion. So if you look at the landmark commerce power case, Gibbons versus Ogden, in that case, it's the beginning of what we see in terms of the real execution and complications of state and federal interest in areas of commerce. If you go through the late 19th century, commerce power in 1973, we get this modern treatment of some particular subject matters concerning civil rights, criminal law, and regulation of state government activities. So it gets more complicated. Now, we really divide the universe of commerce into two major periods. One is, prior to 1933, and then we talk about post-1933. There are some seminal events that take place that sort of change the way in which we think about or the courts assess commerce power of Congress. So the groundwork for this, beginning in the pre-1933 period, as I've mentioned, is Gibbons versus Ogden. It's the first major case, rather, where you get cases being constructed in terms of Congress, the congressional cause, rather, in Marshall's opinion in Gibbons versus Ogden, right? So the Gibbons opinion is important because it's the first time in some meaningful way where the courts inject themselves into the idea of commerce. Keep in mind, the court recognizes and respects that there is a difference between the three different branches. And the court, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, accepts that reality and tries not to tread where the other two branches are really responsible, or where there's a conflict between the two branches that really is of a political nature, going back to what we spoke about a long time ago. So in the cases of the facts of Gibbons versus Ogden acquired by the grant of New York legislature, so you've got a state here, right? Monopoly rights to operate steamboats is a steamboat. Very simple, right? Between New York and New Jersey. Now, keep in mind, those are two states. This steamboat is moving between two states. It's crossing over state boundaries, which means you've got commerce taking place between these two states, which clearly would fall under the Commerce Clause, because one of the things that the clause was designed to do was reduce the conflict between the states. Okay, so Gibbons began operating steamboats between New York and New Jersey in violation of Ogden's monopoly. Okay, so Ogden had the monopoly as granted by the state of New York, and Gibbons now is going back and forth. And those boats were licensed under the federal government. So you've got a clashing here, right? You've got New York State basically saying that, this is Ogden's right, exclusive right to go back and forth. And the federal government says, no, it's going to be Gibbons' right to go back and forth. So what you've got is Ogden going to New York and New York State and getting an injunction in New York, ordering Gibbons to stop. So now we've got a conflict, right? So the holding of the court here is interesting. Again, it's Justice Marshall being involved in the decision and fashioning now, what the commerce power here is relative to the states versus the federal government. So in the holding, when the case came before the Supreme Court, Justice Marshall found the injunction against Gibbons invalid on the ground that it was based upon a monopoly that conflicted with the valid federal statute and thus violated the supremacy clause of the Constitution. In other words, New York State could not grant authority between, in terms of the steamboats, a monopoly to one party. It's commerce between the states, and that clearly falls under the control of the federal government for reasons that I've mentioned. All right, so let's take a broad view of the commerce power then, right? Marshall takes that broad look under the Commerce Clause, and he says that Congress could legislate with respect to all commerce, right, and I'm quoting, all commerce which concerns more states than one. That's pretty clear. We know that that's the way in which this works as it's laid out. There's very little confusion over this. So this is important because for the first time, really, the Supreme Court is saying, no, here's what the Constitution means. This is what it's laid out, how it's laid out, and this is how it has to be applied. So Marshall's ability says, look, that to affect commerce occurring within a state is one thing, right? So long as the activity has some commercial connection with another state, federal law could affect New York waters if voyages between New York ended in New Jersey. So also, we don't get Marshall going so far. He says, in quote, the completely internal commerce of a state may be considered as reserved for the state itself, the 10th Amendment. So this is going to change, by the way, post 1933. It's even within a state, and you'll see the reasoning for this, even within a state, there's going to be a problem concerning whether that interstate commerce really is interstate commerce. We begin to blur how we interpret intra from inter.